Many years ago, I was in Berlin. I work a lot in theater, and I was there to watch some plays. And after about a week of seeing some really weird theater, like seriously, it doesn't get any weirder, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to hitchhike to Istanbul? Yeah, I always wanted to visit those wacky Eastern European countries and Turkey, where all these cultures converge. And I know hitchhiking can be risky. But in my experience, in general, mean people do not pick up hitchhikers. In fact, if you want to renew your faith in humanity, try hitchhiking. It's amazing what can happen when you have to entirely rely on the kindness of strangers. And if you don't have a lot of money and a whole lot of time, it's a great way to get around. So in this manner, I zigzagged across Eastern Europe over a few weeks. I stayed in a manic depressive farmer's house in Poland. I drank way too much absinthe in the Czech Republic and fell for this French traveler in a camping ground in the shadows of Dracula's birthplace. And eventually I made it to the shores of the Black Sea coast in Bulgaria. And just on the other side, to the south, on the other side of this mountain range was Turkey. And this mountain range was called the Stranza Mountains. In Bulgarian, it means strange or mystical. And this was a while ago, before everybody was traveling with cell phones, so my main source of information was my Let's Go Eastern European guidebook and a somewhat out-of-date road map that I picked up in a Polish gas station. Now, according to my guidebook, the only way to cross the border from Bulgaria into Turkey was to travel really far inland around this huge Stranza mountain range. But according to my old Polish gas station map, there was a tiny road cutting straight through these Stranza mountains, which in Bulgarian means strange or mystical. So I thought I like the sound of this shortcut, so I headed in that direction, and sure enough, this tiny little mountain dirt road existed. I got dropped off, and I thought, well, I'll just walk along this road and hitchhike whenever a car came by. And it was beautiful. Like it was this windy road along the side of a cliff overlooking this lush ravine, and the sun was out, the sky was blue, and not a car in sight. Like I walked for hours with this big backpack, just beginning to wonder, what if nobody comes? And just then, the sound of a car came rolling up behind me. I turned to see this dusty blue station wagon come around the bend with this big trailer full of old furniture. It looked like something out of the Grapes of Wrath. And there was a whole family inside. There was a mom and dad in the front and these 4 or 5 kids in the back staring at the windows, looking at me, probably wondering what the hell I was doing there. But I didn't care. I was like, yes, I'm saved. Please pick me up. So I stuck out my thumb and tried to look harmless. And they stopped. And I went up to the dad in the front seat. And even though we didn't speak the same language, it was clear he was offering me a ride. So I enthusiastically nodded yes. And he looked at me really puzzled and then started to drive away. And I shouted and ran after him, and he stopped. And again, he offered me a ride, and again, I nodded yes. And again, he started to drive away. So I screamed again, and I caught up with him, and he shook his head and said something in Bulgarian. And I realized this is probably going to be the only car I see on this road all day. So I looked at this man imploringly and nodded yes. And we stared at each other for a few very confusing seconds. And then he shrugged and drove off. The gaggle of kids staring at me in the back seat, just as confused. And as the car disappeared around the mountain bend, I suddenly remembered the Bulgarian culture and customs section in my Let's Go guidebook. In Bulgaria, nodding your head means no, and shaking it means yes. So this dad kept asking me if I wanted a ride, and I kept saying no, and he kept saying yes, and I kept saying no, until he drove away, and I'm thinking, no! Because that really was the only car I saw all day. I walked the rest of the afternoon. I was, sweaty and tired, and finally this ravine opened up into this big valley, and there was a village. I went straight to a cafe to get something to eat, and I asked the woman running it if she knew how I could get to Turkey. And she pointed across the street to this park, and a short, round man in an ill-fitting gray leisure suit speckled with, I want to say, mustard, And I approached this guy. He must have been in his 60s, had a big bushy mustache and wild hair, and he had this cheesy silver chain necklace. He looked like a short, fat version of Borat. And I made it clear that I was trying to get to Turkey, and could he help me out? And he didn't speak much English, but he knew how to say, "No problem." And I offered him some money, which he flatly refused. Instead, he bought me an orange Fanta and offered me the front seat. I thought, great, we're on our way. And I hopped in, but we weren't. We drove slowly around this village, and every time he saw a woman walking down the street, he'd pull up next to them, jump out of the car, open up his trunk, which was full of ladies' panties. Just a big, messy pile of panties of all shapes and sizes and colors and patterns and textures and fabric. And he'd try to sell these women these panties. And he'd chit-chat away to them. He'd take panties out and he'd rub them on his cheek to show how soft they were. And some of these women bought a couple pairs. They were quite happy about it. And he seemed like a really good salesman. And after making what I thought he would consider a few good sales, we started heading out. But as we left the village, he stopped in front of these two old babushka ladies with their little handkerchiefs and shawls and some grocery bags. And I thought, yeah, they might want some panties as well. But no, they jumped into the back seat, and away we went. Panty guy, me, and the babushkas. And by now the sun was setting, and we got to this Turkish border mountain pass, and it was nighttime, and we went through the formalities, and they stamped my passport, and we continued on our way. But now we're on the southern side of the Stranza Mountains, where this thick Mediterranean fog had accumulated, and you couldn't see a thing. But it didn't stop the panty man. No, he looked at me and said, "No problem," and he just floored it. And we were like flying down these windy mountain roads, and I'm thinking, Jesus, we're gonna die. We're gonna fly off the edge of a cliff. But this guy knew every crazy bend in the road, and even though you can see the road. And then I felt something hit in the back of my head and my cheek, and I turned, and the babushkas are in the back with this giant sack of popcorn. And they're stuffing their faces, giggling their asses off, and chucking popped kernels at me. And I think they saw that I was shitting myself with fear, and they wanted to, like, calm me down. And in a weird way, it worked. I figured, well, if they're not worried about flying off a cliff, then maybe I shouldn't be. And they were right. We eventually left the mystical mountains and the mystical mountain mist, and we got to this little Turkish town, and we dropped the babushkas off, and I asked my panty man if he could just leave me at a hotel, and he said, "No problem." But he didn't take me to a hotel. No, instead we drive out of town, and we get back on the highway. I'm thinking, where the hell are we going? And he looks at me and he says, "No problem." And then we drive off the highway and onto a back country road. And he says, "No problem." And then we drive off the back country road and onto a farmer's field along a tractor path. And he says, "No problem." And then we drive off the path and across the field and into a forest and stop in the clearing of this forest, out of sight of all other roads. And I'm thinking, so this is how I die. I'm going to be murdered in a Turkish forest by a Bulgarian panty salesman. And he turns off the car, he looks at me and says, "No problem." Then he reaches in front of me for the glove compartment. I'm thinking, what's it going to be? A knife? A gun? He opens it up and pulls out the biggest wrench I've ever seen. Like it's an industrial plumber's wrench. And I think, shit, that's going to hurt. And then he jumps out of the car, so I jump out as well. And I think, what do I do? Do I run? Do I head for the forest? Do I have to fight him? But he's got the giant wrench. Meanwhile, he's gone around to the back, and from under the panty pile, he pulls out two big, giant, empty water jugs, like the kind for office water dispensers. And then he takes his wrench and a rubber hose and shimmies underneath the car and starts grinding away at something. And then he crawls out with one end of the hose and begins siphoning some kind of liquid out from under the car into the empty water jugs. And I realize, to my great relief, he's not a murderer, nor is he your average panty salesman. He's also a smuggler of gasoline between Bulgaria and Turkey. And once his secret undercarriage compartment of fuel has filled up both of these water jugs to the brim, he seals them, puts them back in the trunk, and we head back into town. And then we pass a couple of convenience stores, and at each one is a paranoid-looking teenage boy who's standing there ready to grab one of the jugs and quickly disappear inside. And then my panty man buys me a shawarma and finds me a hotel and negotiates a room for me at half the price I should have paid. And before he says goodbye, he takes my hand and places in it a silver chain necklace, just like the ones he's wearing. And I thank him, and he says, "No problem." And I wore that necklace for the rest of my time in Turkey and for a while back in Canada, until a friend of mine told me it made me look like a Bulgarian panty salesman.